Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we enter the world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets where even the most tranquil village can harbor a truth as thorny as the deepest rose bush. We venture to a corner of rural England in the early 20th century, a place where civility and gossip intertwine, and where a keen eye and an understanding heart are the only tools one needs to uncover the most intricate of deceptions. Prepare yourselves for a tale woven with the gentle threads of village life, yet stitched through with a subtle menace that only a mind like Miss Marple's can unravel. Now, let us begin with the first chapter of The Secret in the Rose Garden. Chapter 1. The Arrival at Rosemead Hall. The early summer of 1923 brought with it an unusual heat to the sleepy village of Little Firs, a heat that seemed to ripen not only the berries in the hedgerows, but also the seeds of gossip in every parlor. Little Firs, nestled comfortably in a valley renowned for its ancient oak trees and winding lanes, was not a place accustomed to sudden upheavals. Its rhythm was set by the church bells, the baker's delivery rounds, and the predictable seasonal duties of Mr. Prentice, the head gardener at Rosemead Hall, the grandest estate in the parish. It was to this picturesque setting that Miss Jane Marple found herself drawn, not by any particular mystery, but by the pleasant duty of visiting her niece Mabel, who had recently married the local curate, the Reverend Mr. Arthur Grimshaw. Miss Marple, a gentle-mannered spinster from St. Mary Mead, possessed an outward appearance of frail amiability that belied a mind as sharp and intricate as the finest lace. She had a profound understanding of human nature, gleaned from years of observing the small telling dramas of village life, an understanding that had, on more than one occasion, proven invaluable in matters of a rather more serious nature. The subject currently dominating tea-time conversations across Little Firs was the arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Bellamy at Rosemead Hall. The hall, a magnificent Georgian edifice with a facade of mellow stone, had stood empty for nigh on 3 years, its famed rose gardens growing wild, a silent testament to the passing of the old Colonel Hemming. Mrs. Bellamy, a widow of independent means, described by the estate agent as quietly distinguished, had purchased the property sight unseen, or so the rumor went, arriving with a flurry of packing cases and a single stern-faced companion, Miss Hilda Finch. Such an odd way to arrive, isn't it, Aunt Jane? Mabel had chirped over a plate of lemon drizzle cake, her brow furrowed in a charming show of consternation. Not a single call made, not even to the vicar, and she sent word that she wished to be settled before receiving visitors. Miss Marple merely offered a soft, considering hum, her knitting needles clicking a quiet counterpoint to Mabel's gentle fretting. She had, of course, already formed her own initial impressions. From her vantage point in Mabel's front garden, which offered a partial view of Rosemead Hall's eastern wing, Miss Marple had observed an unusual flurry of activity. The chimneys had smoked for days, an army of charwomen had descended and departed, and then, a week passed, the removal vans, followed by a sleek, dark motor car. What struck Miss Marple most was not the lack of social calls — some people simply preferred their privacy — but the particular haste with which Mrs. Bellamy seemed to have retreated behind the hall's imposing gates. Even Mr. Prentice, the stoic gardener who had been retained by Mrs. Bellamy, seemed uncharacteristically subdued when he came to the vicarage for a cup of tea, a tradition he had maintained for decades. "The roses, you see, Miss Marple," Mr. Prentice had confided, stirring his tea with a heavy hand. "They're magnificent still. Even after 3 years of neglect, some of the old English varieties are blooming their hearts out. But Mrs. Bellamy, that is, she's given me specific instructions. No new plantings, just to maintain the existing beds. And, a very particular interest in the old sundial garden. Spends hours there, she does, just looking." Miss Marple had merely nodded, her eyes twinkling with a knowing light. The sundial garden was the most secluded part of Rosemead Hall's grounds, tucked away behind a tall yew hedge, a place of quiet contemplation, or perhaps quiet observation. 2 weeks into Mrs. Bellamy's residency, the first formal invitation arrived, not for a social gathering, but for a brief interview with Mr. Prentice regarding the garden's layout, delivered by a rather stiff Miss Finch. This was followed by an invitation to the vicar and Mabel for Sunday tea, which Miss Marple naturally would accompany them to. The day of the tea arrived gloriously sunny. As they approached the hall, a faint, almost imperceptible scent wafted on the air, not of roses, though their perfume was abundant, but something metallic perhaps, or faintly acrid, quickly masked by the floral sweetness. Miss Marple dismissed it as a trick of the breeze, or perhaps a new kind of fertilizer. Mrs. Bellamy received them in a drawing-room of quiet elegance, decorated in muted tones of cream and rose. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a neatly coiffed gray bun and eyes that, while polite, seemed to hold a peculiar wariness. Her conversation was perfectly adequate, if a little stiff, dwelling mostly on the practicalities of managing such a large house. Miss Finch hovered in the background, a silent sentinel. During a lull in the conversation, as the Reverend Grimshaw admired a rare botanical print, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a small, ornate silver box resting on a side table. It was a charming piece, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. As Mrs. Bellamy spoke, her hand, with an almost imperceptible gesture, subtly shifted the box, turning it slightly away from Miss Marple's direct line of sight. It was a movement so slight, so natural, that anyone else might have missed it, attributing it to a nervous fidget. But Miss Marple noticed. Then, as the tea drew to a close and they prepared to depart, a small incident occurred. Mrs. Bellamy, in handing Miss Marple her gloves, seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, her gaze fixed not on Miss Marple's face, but on something just beyond her, in the hallway. A shadow, perhaps, a fleeting reflection. When Miss Marple turned her head, there was nothing there. Yet Mrs. Bellamy's lips, though smiling politely, seemed to press together just a little too tightly, and a faint tremor ran through her hand. It was an unsettling detail, a tiny discord in the otherwise harmonious symphony of a polite afternoon call, and it made Miss Marple wonder precisely what secrets Rosemead Hall was guarding within its elegant walls. Chapter 2. Whispers and Roses. The peculiar tremor in Mrs. Bellamy's hand and the subtle shift of the silver box lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after their visit to Rosemead Hall. Such small observations, she knew, were often the most telling. Back at the vicarage, over a supper of cold ham and potato salad, Mabel recounted her impressions of Mrs. Bellamy, finding her perfectly genteel, if a trifle reserved. The Reverend Grimshaw, ever charitable, put it down to the natural reticence of a widow settling into new surroundings. Miss Marple, however, had seen a glint of something else in Mrs. Bellamy's eyes, a flicker of anxiety, perhaps, or a deep-seated apprehension. It reminded her of Mrs. Armitage, the draper's wife in St. Mary Mead, who had always arranged her bolts of cloth with an almost obsessive precision, a sure sign, as it turned out, that her younger brother was secretly selling off their grandmother's silverware. Human nature, Miss Marple often mused, was remarkably consistent, regardless of social standing or postcode. The next few days saw a gradual accretion of small, unsettling details concerning Rosemead Hall. Miss Plummet, the village's unofficial chronicler of local affairs, a woman whose every waking moment seemed devoted to the meticulous collection and dissemination of neighborhood news, stopped by the vicarage. "Have you heard, dear Mabel?" she began, lowering her voice conspiratorially, though her tone was perfectly audible to Miss Marple, who was ostensibly engrossed in tending Mabel's geraniums. "Young Timothy, the delivery boy from the grocer's, says he saw the most extraordinary thing at the hall." Timothy, it transpired, had been making his morning. rounds leaving a basket of provisions at the hall's back door. He had glimpsed Mr. Prentice, the gardener, in the famous rose garden, looking rather disheveled, and quite pale he was, Miss Plummet recounted, nodding sagely. Timothy said Mr. Prentice had just found one of his prized pruning shears, the Ewa special German steel ones, lying in the middle of a bed of Queen of Denmark roses. But the odd thing was, he was sure he'd put them away himself the night before, locked them in his shed. Said it was like someone had taken them out, used them, and just left them there for him to find. Miss Marple paused in her pruning, a single dead head of geranium held delicately between her fingers. A gardener of Mr. Prentice's meticulous nature would never misplace his tools, let alone leave them out overnight. Such a man, Miss Marple knew from her own observations of her St. Mary Mead neighbors, possessed an almost sacred reverence for his instruments. Later that afternoon, a more direct, if equally subtle, unsettling detail presented itself. Miss Marple was taking a solitary stroll down the lane that bordered the hall's perimeter wall, admiring the ancient wisteria that cascaded over the stone. As she passed a particularly dense thicket of wild roses that spilled from the estate, she caught a whiff of that same peculiar metallic scent she had noticed on the day of their visit. It was faint, almost evanescent, quickly lost to the rich perfume of the roses and honeysuckle. But it was definitely there, a sharp, almost industrial note amidst the pastoral harmony. It was not the smell of fertilizer, nor of damp earth, nor even of the usual domestic sense of a large house. It was something alien. She paused, inhaling deeply, trying to pinpoint the source, but the breeze shifted, carrying only the scent of green leaves and sun-warmed petals. Yet the memory of it lingered, a tiny prickle of unease. The next day, during her daily constitutional walk, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Ogden, the vicar's wife, looking rather flustered as she returned from a call at the hall. "Oh, Miss Marple." "Dear," Mrs. Ogden exclaimed, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief, "I've just had the most peculiar experience at Rosemead Hall. Mrs. Bellamy, you see, is terribly particular about her linen. She called me over to show me a curious mark on one of her new embroidered pillowcases. A faint brownish stain, quite small, but she was terribly upset about it, insisted it must be the laundry maid's carelessness. But the oddest thing was, as I was examining it, she snatched it away quite suddenly, almost as if she didn't want me to look too closely, and she kept glancing towards the window, as if expecting someone." Mrs. Ogden, a kind soul, dismissed it as Mrs. Bellamy's fussiness. But Miss Marple's mind, like a finely tuned instrument, registered the discordant notes. A misplaced tool, an odd scent, a snatched pillowcase. Individually, they were trifles. Collectively, they began to form a pattern, like scattered pieces of a mosaic that, when viewed together, might reveal a startling image. That evening, as dusk settled over Little Furs, Miss Marple sat by the open window of her guest room, the gentle sounds of the village drifting in. She watched a lone light flicker on in an upstairs window of Rosemead Hall. Then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw a figure briefly silhouetted against the light. Not Mrs. Bellamy, whose profile she was beginning to recognize, nor Miss Finch. It was a man, indistinct in the fading light, but undoubtedly male. He stood for a moment, looking out, before the curtain was drawn, plunging the window into darkness once more. Miss Marple frowned. Who else, she wondered, was residing in the quiet grandeur of Rosemead Hall, unknown to the villagers, and why? The Secrecy? Chapter 3. The Gardener's Lament. The mystery of the fleeting silhouette at Rosemead Hall added another layer to the subtle unease that was beginning to permeate Little Furs. Miss Marple, ever discreet, merely observed, allowing the currents of village life to bring her more information. And information, in a village, always had a way of surfacing, usually through the channels of domestic service, or, in this case, the venerable Mr. Prentice, the gardener. Mr. Prentice, a man whose life was as rooted and predictable as the ancient. Oaks he tended had developed a pronounced stoop and a worried frown in the weeks since Mrs. Bellamy's arrival. He visited the vicarage more frequently for tea, drawn perhaps by the quiet empathy of Miss Marple, who, unlike the other villagers, offered less advice and more genuine, attentive listening. "It's the roses, Miss Marple," Mr. Prentice began. One blustery afternoon, shaking his head as he accepted a cup of strong Assam. Beautiful as ever, yes, but disturbed. Not by pests, mind you. No blight, no aphids beyond the usual. It's human interference. Miss Marple inclined her head, encouraging him to continue. "Tell me, Mr. Prentice, what sort of interference?" He sighed, running a calloused hand through his thinning gray hair. "Little things at first. The pruning shears, as I told you. Then, just last week, I found a trowel, my good steel one, stuck into the earth near the souvenir de la Malmaison bed. It looked like it had been used to dig, but only shallowly, and it wasn't where I'd left it." Miss Marple's eyes, usually so soft, sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Someone is using your tools, Mr. Prentice, and leaving them for you to find?" "Precisely, ma'am. And not just the tools, the soil itself. There are disturbances, small ones, mind, patches where the earth has been turned over lightly, and always in the evenings, after I've finished for the day. I retamp them down, smooth them over, thinking it's a badger perhaps, though I've never seen a badger favor the rose beds. But then, the next morning, there they are again." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "And the footprints, Miss Marple. Small, neat ones, not mine, too dainty for any man's boot." Miss Marple considered this, her knitting needles resting for a moment in her lap. "And you've mentioned this to Mrs. Bellamy?" Mr. Prentice snorted softly. "Indeed, she dismissed it as my overactive imagination, said it was probably stray cats." "Cats! As if a cat would turn over soil with a trowel, and she gave me a rather pointed look, I thought, told me to ensure the garden was secure, as if it wasn't before." The gardener's agitated state was clear. This was a man whose sense of order and control was being systematically undermined. Miss Marple recalled the faint metallic scent she had detected. Could it be connected? "Have you seen anything unusual, Mr. Prentice, when you're closing up for the night?" she asked gently. He hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if the rose garden itself held the answer. "Well, I have heard things, faint sounds like scratching sometimes, or a soft rustling. Comes from the sundial garden, mostly. And once, just once, I thought I saw a light. A small, moving light, like a lantern being carried very carefully, bobbing about amongst the yew hedges late at night." "A light?" Miss Marple repeated, her tone calm but intent. "Aye, but it vanished before I could properly make it out. Could have been a trick of the moonlight, I suppose. My eyes aren't what they used to be." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "But it didn't feel like moonlight, if you take my meaning. It felt purposeful. The small, neat footprints, the purposefully used tools, the faint scratching sounds, a moving light in the dead of night. These were not the actions of cats or badgers. Someone was deliberately disturbing the rose garden at Rosemead Hall, and doing so with a strange stealth and purpose. And Mrs. Bellamy's dismissive attitude, coupled with her pointed look, suggested she might know more than she was letting on, or perhaps was trying to conceal something. "Mr. Prentice," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying a comforting weight of understanding, "please be careful when you are working late. And if you find anything else, anything at all, no matter how small, please do tell me." The gardener nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes that someone, at least, believed him. He finished his tea, a little less agitated, but the worried frown still etched upon his face. As he departed, Miss Marple went to the window, watching his figure trudge down the path. Her gaze then shifted to the distant, stately silhouette of Rosemead Hall. The rose garden, a symbol of beauty and cultivation, was being desecrated not by nature's caprice, but by a human hand. What was being sought, or perhaps what was being hidden beneath those fragrant bushes? The subtle details were beginning to align, like petals unfurling in the morning sun, revealing a pattern that hinted at something far more complex than mere mischief. Just then, a small package was delivered to the vicarage. It was from Mrs. Bellamy, a peace offering of sorts after the Sunday tea, a box of rather exquisite chocolates. But as Miss Marple opened the lid, she noticed something pressed amongst the delicate papers within, something that had clearly fallen in by accident. It was a single dried rose petal, a very dark crimson, not from any variety Miss Marple recognized as growing at Rosemead Hall, and tangled within its velvety folds was a minute, almost invisible fragment of dark, almost black thread. A trifle, to be sure, but one that spoke volumes about another presence, perhaps one that did not quite belong. Chapter 4. A hidden compartment. The crimson rose petal, with its minute dark thread, provided Miss Marple with a tangible, albeit enigmatic, piece of the puzzle. It was a detail that Mrs. Bellamy would surely not have intended to share, suggesting it originated from a source other than the Hall's carefully tended gardens or Mrs. Bellamy's own effects. Miss Marple carefully placed it in a small envelope, a silent testament to its potential significance. The next morning the village was abuzz with a fresh piece of news, delivered by Mrs. Ogden, who had just returned from her weekly visit to the lending library. Such a fuss, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bellamy's companion, Miss Finch, was at the grocer's, quite distraught. It seems a small silver thimble, a family heirloom, has gone missing from Mrs. Bellamy's sewing box. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking a steady rhythm as she knitted a baby bonnet for Mabel's expected arrival. And has it been found? Mrs. Ogden shook her head. No, not yet. Miss Finch was quite insistent that it wasn't mislaid. She, said Mrs. Bellamy, was particularly fond of it, a gift from her late mother. And what's more, Mrs. Ogden lowered her voice. Miss Finch implied it wasn't the first time something had gone astray. Apparently, a rare edition of Tennyson's poems from Mrs. Bellamy's personal collection was found tucked under a rose bush by Mr. Prentice just a few days ago after having been missing from her drawing-room for a week. A thimble, a book, pruning shears, items of varying value, both sentimental and monetary, disappearing and reappearing in odd places. It was a pattern of selective pilfering, or perhaps a very peculiar game. Miss Marple recalled the silver box Mrs. Bellamy had subtly shielded from view during their tea. Could these disappearances be a distraction or a desperate search? The vicarage received another invitation from Rosemead Hall a few days later, an informal tea, this time specifically for Miss Marple and Mabel, as the vicar was away at a diocesan meeting. Mrs. Bellamy, the note read, wished to discuss some of the local charities. It was an excellent opportunity, Miss Marple thought, to observe the hall and its mistress more closely. Upon their arrival, Miss Marple noted that the peculiar metallic scent was more pronounced today, a faint but definite tang in the air, especially in the vicinity of the entrance hall. It was like something old and enclosed, newly exposed to the air. She made a mental note. During their conversation about the village fete, Miss Marple, with her characteristic gentle curiosity, steered the conversation towards the hall's history. Such a magnificent old house, Mrs. Bellamy. I imagine it holds many secrets within its walls. Mrs. Bellamy's smile, always a little brittle, tightened. Indeed, Miss Marple, all old houses do, though I trust Rosemead Halls are merely architectural, not scandalous. She laughed, a sound that lacked genuine amusement. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were not on Mrs. Bellamy, but on the mantelpiece above the large ornate fireplace. A small, beautifully carved wooden box sat there, exquisitely detailed, clearly antique. It seemed slightly out of place amongst the more conventional ornaments, almost as if it had been recently moved. As she subtly extended her hand, ostensibly To adjust a loose thread on her cardigan, her fingers brushed against the polished wood. She noticed a faint scratch on its base, and a small, almost invisible seam that ran along one side, slightly mismatched in its grain, a hidden compartment. Perhaps it was the sort of secret often found in old, cunningly crafted pieces. As if sensing Miss Marple's attention, Mrs. Bellamy immediately redirected the conversation, speaking rather too loudly about the merits of local jam. It was another small, almost imperceptible signal confirming Miss Marple's suspicions. Mrs. Bellamy was guarding something, and she was growing increasingly agitated. Later, as Miss Finch served the tea, Miss Marple noted the companion's unusually nervous demeanor. Miss Finch, a woman of sharp features and a generally stern countenance, usually projected an air of unflappable efficiency. Today, however, her hands trembled slightly as she poured, and her eyes darted frequently towards Mrs. Bellamy, as if seeking reassurance, or perhaps fearing reproach. As they rose to leave, Miss Marple, with a deliberately slow movement, retrieved her umbrella from the stand in the hall. As she did so, her gaze fell upon a heavy oak chest near the front door, a handsome piece but somewhat imposing. She noticed a faint dark smudge on its surface, almost hidden in the grain of the wood. It was not dust, but a stain recently made, and it had a faint, almost metallic smell, similar to the one she had detected earlier. It was in a spot that seemed peculiar for a domestic accident. It was almost as if something had been placed upon it or removed from it, leaving a slight residue. Miss Marple's quiet gaze swept over the hall, taking in the grand staircase, the shadowed corners, the closed doors. Rosemead Hall, for all its daytime elegance, seemed to hum with a hidden tension, a silent orchestration of unease. The missing thimble, the book, Mr. Prentice's disturbed rose beds, Mrs. Bellamy's agitated secrecy, the fidgeting companion, the peculiar scent, the subtly scratched wooden box, and now a new, metallic stain. Each was a whisper, but together they were beginning to form a chorus. As she stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, Miss Marple glanced back at the hall. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Bellamy was not merely trying to hide a secret, but that she herself was caught in a trap, her every move watched, her every item scrutinized. And the thimble and the book, Miss Marple suspected, had not been stolen, but purposefully moved, or perhaps placed as a message. A message for whom, she wondered, and to what end? The elegant facade of Rosemead Hall was slowly, inexorably beginning to crack. Chapter 5. The Faded Photograph. The incident of the thimble and the book continued to circulate through Little Furs, evolving with each retelling into more dramatic proportions. Miss Plummet naturally had a theory involving a gang of traveling gypsies, while Mrs. Ogden suspected a disloyal housemaid. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly unconvinced by either explanation. The pattern of missing and reappearing items, the strange disturbances in the rose garden, and Mrs. Bellamy's increasingly guarded demeanor suggested a more intricate and far more personal design. A week passed, marked by further small oddities. Mr. Prentice, the gardener, reported finding a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, clearly not a garden ornament, half buried near the base of an ancient wisteria vine, not far from the sundial garden. It was a beautiful piece, but utterly out of place. He had, he said, shown it to Miss Finch, who had merely taken it with a sharp nod and dismissed him without comment. Then came the invitation to Mrs. Bellamy's long-anticipated garden party. It was to be a small affair, strictly limited to the village's established gentry and the Reverend and Mrs. Grimshaw. Miss Marple, as a guest of Mabel's, was included. The general consensus among the villagers was that Mrs. Bellamy was finally making an effort to conform to local expectations. Miss Marple, however, suspected it was more a tactical maneuver than a genuine desire for social engagement. The day of the party was glorious, the rose garden a riot of color and perfume. Mrs. Bellamy, dressed in a rather severe dove-gray gown, moved amongst her guests with a determined air of hospitality, though her smiles seemed to lack genuine warmth. Miss Finch, equally stiff in her dark attire, circulated with platters of delicate sandwiches, her eyes, Miss Marple noticed, constantly sweeping the grounds, as if on a perpetual watch. Miss Marple, armed with a cup of Earl Grey and a discreet plate of cucumber sandwiches, drifted towards the sundial garden, a place she felt held a particular significance. The roses here were even more profuse, climbing in fragrant abundance over a crumbling stone wall. The ancient sundial itself, weathered and moss-covered, seemed to hold a silent story, as she admired a particularly rare variety of deep purple. Rose, Miss Marple, overheard a snippet of conversation between Mrs. Bellamy and Colonel Abernathy, a retired officer with a booming voice and a penchant for local history. "Remarkable roses, Mrs. Bellamy," the colonel boomed. "These black baccara are quite unique in this region. The old Colonel Hemming cultivated them himself. A real enthusiast he was. Said they reminded him of his time in India. You know, he used to have the most astonishing collection of photographs from his travels, all over the empire, even some old family portraits. Kept them in a special leather-bound album, he did, in that small sitting room off the library." Mrs. Bellamy's response was immediate and sharp. "Oh, indeed, Colonel, the previous owner's effects were, of course, disposed of. I believe I saw some albums at the auction, but I prefer to make the house my own, if you understand." Her tone was dismissive, almost cutting, clearly signaling an end to that line of conversation. The colonel, somewhat taken aback, merely grunted. Miss Marple, however, found this particular dismissal rather telling. It was too vehement. And why would a woman so determined to establish herself not wish to cultivate good relations with local gentry, especially an expert on the very house she now inhabited? As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple continued her quiet observation. She noticed Mrs. Bellamy frequently glancing towards a particular rose bush near the sundial. It was a hybrid tea rose, peace, with large creamy yellow petals tipped with a delicate pink. It seemed a perfectly ordinary, if beautiful, rose. Then, as Miss Finch bent to retrieve a drop napkin near this very bush, something small and glinting caught Miss Marple's eye. It lay half hidden amongst the fallen petals, almost camouflaged. It was a small silver locket tarnished with age, and clearly not a piece of modern jewelry. Miss Marple's heart gave a little flutter. Before Miss Marple could even consider drawing attention to it, Miss Finch, with a movement so swift it was almost sleight of hand, snatched up the locket. Her face, usually so impassive, was a mask of alarm. She glanced around nervously, her eyes meeting Mrs. Bellamy's across the lawn. Mrs. Bellamy, in turn, had seen the exchange and immediately looked away, her lips tightening into a thin line. Miss Finch quickly tucked the locket into the pocket of her apron, but not before Miss Marple caught a brief glimpse of its open interior. Inside, there was a faded, sepia-toned photograph. It was of a young woman, her features soft but distinct, with a wealth of dark hair swept up in an elegant style of an earlier era. What truly startled Miss Marple, however, was not the age of the photograph, but the subtle yet undeniable resemblance. The eyes, the line of the jaw, they were remarkably similar to those of Miss Hilda Finch herself, the stern-faced companion. Miss Marple feigned a sudden interest in a nearby butterfly, allowing the moment to pass. But the image of the locket and the young woman within it was etched in her mind. So, the prim Miss Finch had a secret, a past perhaps linked to Rosemead Hall itself? Or was it Mrs. Bellamy's secret, entrusted to her companion? The implications began to dawn on Miss Marple, unsettling as they were. The rose garden was not just a place of beauty, but a repository of hidden truths, and the surface calm of Mrs. Bellamy's garden party was merely a fragile veneer over a rapidly deepening mystery. Chapter 6. A disturbance in the night, the faded photograph in the silver locket, and Miss Finch's swift, almost guilty retrieval of it, gave Miss Marple much to ponder. The resemblance between the young woman in the photograph and Miss Finch was too striking to be a mere coincidence. It suggested a familial connection or perhaps a secret identity. Why the secrecy? And why was it hidden in the rose garden? The garden party concluded without further incident, but the underlying tension remained palpable, at least to Miss Marple's perceptive senses. Mrs. Bellamy's strained politeness, Miss Finch's nervous glances, and the inexplicable presence of the locket itself all added to the growing mosaic of unease at Rosemead Hall. 2 nights later, the quiet slumber of Little Furs was broken by the unexpected clang of the church bell, rung not in its usual measured cadence for service, but in a frantic, urgent peal. Reverend Grimshaw, roused from his bed, immediately donned his dressing gown and hurried out, followed closely by a worried Mabel. Miss Marple, too, was instantly alert. Such an alarm in the dead of night could only mean one thing: trouble. It quickly emerged that the disturbance originated from Rosemead Hall. A local constable, P.C. Davies, had been summoned, and by the time the Reverend and Mabel arrived, came a small crowd of curious villagers drawn by the bell had gathered at the hall gates. Miss Marple, wrapped in a warm shawl, joined them a few minutes later, her presence a silent, reassuring anchor amidst the escalating anxiety. P.C. Davies, a young man prone to officiousness, was attempting to control the crowd and manage the scene. "Nothing to see here, folks. Just a minor incident. Mrs. Bellamy and Miss Finch are quite safe." From the snippets of conversation among the servants who were huddled together near the kitchen door, the story began to coalesce. A window in Mrs. Bellamy's study on the ground floor had been found slightly ajar, and a small antique inkwell from her desk had been overturned, spilling its contents across some important papers. Nothing of obvious value had been taken, but the room had been disturbed, as if someone had rummaged through drawers, but without the usual destructive intent of a common burglar. Mrs. Bellamy, it was said, was terribly shaken, but insisted it was merely a clumsy opportunist, perhaps someone from a neighboring village, trying their luck. P.C. Davies, after a cursory inspection, seemed inclined to agree. "No signs of forced entry, ma'am. Likely an open window and a curious hand. Nothing valuable lost, you say?" His tone suggested he found it a bothersome triviality. Miss Marple, however, found the constable's interpretation far too simplistic. The specific nature of the disturbance: a window ajar, an overturned inkwell, rummaged drawers but no theft, seemed less like a clumsy break-in and more like a deliberate search, perhaps a message, or even a staged incident. She caught sight of Mr. Prentice, the gardener, standing a little apart from the other servants, his face pale and drawn. He was clutching a small, dirt-encrusted implement in his hand, something small and sharp. Miss Marple approached him quietly. "Mr. Prentice, are you all right?" he started, as if awoken from a trance. "Oh, Miss Marple, dreadful business, isn't it? But it's more than that, I tell you. I was out late, checking on a rose bush I thought might have black spot. I heard something, a faint tinkling sound like glass." He gestured vaguely towards the ground near the study window, and I saw a shadow just for a moment, moving away towards the sundial garden, disappearing behind the yew hedge. Then, just after, I heard the church bell. "Glass, Mr. Prentice?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. He nodded, then, almost as an afterthought, extended his hand, showing her the object he held. "Found this near the Gypsy Boy rose bush, not 10 yards from that window. Don't know what it is. Looks like part of something." In his palm lay a tiny, irregular shard of glass, no bigger than Miss Marple's little fingernail. It was dark, almost black, and when she held it up, it glinted with an unusual reddish hue under the moonlight. It was not the transparent, everyday glass of a window pane, nor the pale green of a bottle. It was different, and the implement he held was an old, small, very sharp chisel caked with fresh earth. "And this chisel?" Miss Marple inquired. "My own." "Miss Marple? Been missing from my shed for 2 days. I wondered who'd taken it. It's what I use for delicate work, grafting, and such." Miss Marple's mind raced. An overturned inkwell, a small shard of unusual glass, a missing chisel, a shadow moving towards the sundial garden, and the constant, peculiar scent she had noticed. These were not the hallmarks of an ordinary burglar. This was too precise, too specific. Someone was looking for something small and concealed, and they were using the rose garden, and perhaps even the hall's disturbances, as an elaborate smokescreen. As P.C. Davies prepared to leave, dismissing the incident, as closed, Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settle in her bones. The danger was not over. It was merely escalating. The small, dark glass shard so easily overlooked was a key, she felt sure. A key to what exactly, she did not yet know. But the secret in the rose garden, she suspected, was far more volatile and perilous than anyone in Little Furs could possibly imagine. And Miss Marple had a growing sense that Mr. Prentice, who had seen that shadow and heard that tinkling sound, was now firmly in the line of fire. Chapter 7. The Anonymous Letter. The disturbance at Rosemead Hall, quickly dismissed by P.C. Davies as a non-event, continued to be the main topic of conversation in Little Furs. Yet, for all the speculation, no one seemed to connect the dots as Miss Marple did. The peculiar glass shard, the missing chisel, the staged nature of the break-in, all pointed to a carefully orchestrated sequence of events, not random mischief. Mr. Prentice, after his discovery, had become even more withdrawn, visibly jumpy, his usually steady hands now prone to trembling. Miss Marple visited him in the garden shed a few days later, ostensibly to ask about a rare variety of delphinium. She noticed a new lock on the shed door and a general air of enhanced security. "Anything else?" "Unusual, Mr. Prentice?" she inquired gently, her eyes sweeping over his workbench. He shook his head, looking over his shoulder nervously. "No, Miss Marple, not since that night. But I feel it, you see, a presence, someone watching, and the sundial garden. I feel less inclined to go there now." His fear was palpable, and Miss Marple realized that whatever secret was buried, literally or figuratively, in the rose garden, it had a potent and terrifying effect on those who came too close. Then another development, this time concerning Mrs. Bellamy directly. Mrs. Ogden, the vicar's wife, called at the vicarage, looking utterly distraught. She clutched a crumpled handkerchief in her hand, her eyes wide with alarm. "Oh, Miss Marple, Mabel! It's Mrs. Bellamy. I've just come from the hall. The poor woman is in a terrible state. She received an anonymous letter this morning, a truly dreadful thing. She wouldn't let me read it fully, but she showed me a few lines, just enough to give me a chill." Mrs. Ogden shivered dramatically. "What did it say, dear?" Mabel asked, placing a comforting hand on Mrs. Ogden's arm. "Threats, Mabel, terrible threats. Something about unearthing the past and secrets coming to light, and it specifically mentioned the rose garden." Mrs. Bellamy was beside herself, pacing up and down, clutching the letter, saying she didn't know who could possibly know such things, that her past was buried, utterly buried. Mrs. Ogden, a kind but somewhat naive woman, was genuinely concerned for Mrs. Bellamy. But Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtle currents beneath the surface, felt a prickle of skepticism. Mrs. Bellamy's agitation, her refusal to show the entire letter, her specific choice of words. Buried, utterly buried. It all seemed a little too theatrical. And what did Mrs. Bellamy say she would do? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, her gaze fixed on a distant patch of sunlight on the lawn. She said she would ignore it, that it was clearly the work of a malicious mind. But her hands were shaking so dreadfully, and she kept saying she mustn't let it get to her, that she must stand firm against it. She seemed almost defiant, Miss Marple, rather than merely frightened. Defiance. That was the word that struck Miss Marple. A genuinely terrified person usually sought help or retreated. Defiance implied a struggle, an active resistance to an opposing force. And if the letter was truly anonymous, why would Mrs. Bellamy declare her intention to stand firm rather than say, "Alert the police"? Miss Marple reflected on the implications. An anonymous letter specifically mentioning the rose garden and unearthing the past. It could be a genuine threat from someone who knew Mrs. Bellamy's secrets, or it could be a carefully crafted piece of misdirection designed to create a specific impression. Perhaps Mrs. Bellamy was creating a narrative for public consumption, a story to explain away future discoveries or incidents. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to take a solitary walk heading towards the hall's perimeter, near the section of the yew hedge that bordered the sundial garden. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of summer. As she approached, she saw Miss Finch, the companion, standing by the hedge, not looking at the roses, but gazing intently towards the hall, her posture rigid. She was holding a small, dark object in her hand, which she quickly slipped into her pocket as she sensed Miss Marple's presence. "Lovely day, Miss Finch," Miss Marple offered pleasantly. Miss Finch jumped, startled, her face tightening. "Oh, Miss Marple, indeed, just admiring the view." Her voice was sharper than usual, her eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple merely smiled, but her mind was busy. Miss Finch, the guardian of the faded photograph, the woman with the hidden past, was also showing signs of extreme strain. The anonymous letter, the incidents in the garden, the break-in, they were all intertwined, each thread pulling tighter around Rosemead Hall and its inhabitants. As she turned to leave, Miss Marple noticed something else, something lying, near the base of the yew hedge, almost hidden by the shadows. It was a single crumpled piece of paper, small and folded. It was not a letter, but something that looked like a fragment of a calendar or a diary entry. Curiosity, a gentle but insistent force, compelled her to bend down. Discreetly she picked it up. Unfolding it, she saw a single, handwritten date, July 17th, and underneath, in a scrawled, almost frantic hand, one word, "Remember." The paper was old, brittle, and had clearly been exposed to the elements. Miss Marple's heart gave a lurch. July 17th was just 3 days away, and the chilling injunction to remember suggested a deadline, or perhaps a significant anniversary. Someone was not merely sending threats, but actively counting down to an event. And Mrs. Bellamy's defiance began to make a terrifying kind of sense. Chapter 8. The Second Victim. The crumpled fragment of paper, with its stark date of July 17th and the single imperative word, "Remember," was a chilling development. It transformed the mysterious disturbances at Rosemead Hall from mere oddities into a premonition of something more sinister. Miss Marple carefully folded the paper and tucked it into her reticule, a silent witness to a growing danger. The countdown, she instinctively felt, was not just for an event, but for a confrontation. Mrs. Bellamy's theatrical defiance now seemed less like a woman struggling against an external threat, and more like a woman steeling herself for a planned revelation, or perhaps a prepared defense. The anonymous letter, Miss Marple suspected, was not an unwelcome missive, but a strategic piece of the puzzle, carefully placed to manage perceptions. But what of the specific date? And who was doing the remembering? The calm that followed Mrs. Ogden's visit was short-lived. The very next morning a frantic shout brought Miss Marple, Mabel, and the Reverend Grimshaw rushing out of the vicarage. It was young Timothy, the grocer's boy, his face white with fear. "It's Mr. Prentice at Rosemead Hall. He's fallen. And it looks bad." A sense of dread settled over Miss Marple. She knew, with a terrible certainty, that this was no accident. Mr. Prentice had been close to the truth, and now he had become a victim. They hurried to the hall, where a small crowd had already gathered near the main gate. P.C. Davies was there again, looking even more flustered than before. An ambulance had been summoned from the next town. They found Mr. Prentice lying at the base of a tall ladder, crumpled and still, near one of the oldest, gnarliest apple trees at the edge of the rose garden, not far from the sundial garden. He had been pruning its upper branches, a dangerous job for a man of his age, but one he had performed for decades with unwavering skill. A heavy, gnarled branch lay beside him, broken clean off. He must have lost his footing, P.C. Davies pronounced, his voice sounding a little too loud, a little too certain. These old ladders can be treacherous, and that branch, it looks like it gave way under his weight. But as Miss Marple approached, her gentle eyes missed nothing. Mr. Prentice was stirring, groaning softly, his brow furrowed in pain. His head was bleeding, and his left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. But it was his eyes that caught Miss Marple's attention, wide with a mixture of pain and a deeper, more profound terror. As the ambulance men carefully attended to him, Mr. Prentice mumbled, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't an accident, Miss Marple. He pushed it. The ladder. It was pushed." P.C. Davies immediately interjected, "Nonsense, Mr. Prentice. You're concussed. Just rest." But Mr. Prentice shook his head weakly. "No, I saw him. A shadow moving from the sundial garden, and something glinting like metal. Just before the ladder swayed, he was there. He was watching. He tried to raise a hand, pointing vaguely towards the yew hedge, towards the sundial garden, but the pain overwhelmed him, and he sank back, unconscious. Miss Marple's gaze followed his intended gesture, the sundial garden again, and a shadow, glinting metal. It was precisely what Mr. Prentice had described seeing on the night of the break-in. This time, however, the consequences were far more severe. Mrs. Bellamy and Miss Finch emerged from the hall, looking appropriately shocked. Mrs. Bellamy wrung her hands. "Oh, the poor man, always so careful. I warned him about that old ladder." Her words, however, sounded hollow, almost rehearsed. Miss Finch, for her part, looked pale and even more rigid than usual, her eyes darting nervously towards the yew hedge, just as Mr. Prentice's had. Miss Marple observed the scene with a quiet intensity. The ladder, old perhaps, but sturdy. The branch broken off in a way that seemed too clean, too deliberate, as if it had been severed by a sharp tool rather than snapped by a falling man. And Mr. Prentice's terrified insistence that he had been pushed. As Mr. Prentice was carefully loaded into the ambulance, Miss Marple gently moved towards the base of the apple tree. She knelt, ostensibly to examine a patch of unusual moss. But her eyes were scanning the ground, looking for anything that might support Mr. Prentice's story. Hidden in the long grass, half buried in the soft earth, she found it. A small, heavy object. She picked it up discreetly. It was a well-used, antique garden shears, clearly very sharp, and still bearing traces of a fresh cut on its blade. It was not one of Mr. Prentice's common tools. It was too old, too finely crafted, and, most significantly, it had a small, almost imperceptible engraving on its wooden handle. A tiny stylized rose, identical to the one carved on the small wooden bird Mr. Prentice had found days earlier. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately attacked Mr. Prentice, using his own tools, or tools designed to appear as such, to remove a witness or to silence a growing suspicion. And the small shears, so perfectly made, so out of place, hinted at a very specific ownership. The glint of metal Mr. Prentice had seen was probably the blade of these very shears, used to cut the branch or perhaps to ward him off. Miss Marple knew with a sudden chilling clarity that the anonymous letter, the break-in, the peculiar items, and now Mr. Prentice's injury were all part of an escalating and desperate scheme. Someone was trying to protect a secret in the rose garden, and they were willing to go to terrifying lengths to do so. The date, July 17th, loomed large and ominous in her mind. Whatever was meant to happen then, it was clearly connected to the past of Rosemead Hall and the enigmatic Mrs. Bellamy. And Miss Marple realized with a pang that she had to act, and soon, before the secret claimed another, perhaps final, victim. Chapter 9. Unearthing the Past. Mr. Prentice's fall, deemed an unfortunate accident by the authorities, sent a ripple of genuine concern through Little Firs, overshadowing the earlier minor incidents. He was taken to the county hospital, his arm broken and suffering from a concussion, but alive. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to believe in accidents when a pattern of deliberate interference was so clearly established. The old garden shears, with its distinctive rose engraving, was now carefully hidden within her own belongings, a piece of damning evidence. The approaching date of July 17th, with its chilling "Remember" injunction, weighed heavily on Miss Marple. She had spent the preceding days quietly piecing together every detail, every observation, every overheard whisper. The peculiar metallic scent, the disturbed soil, the misplaced tools, the hidden locket with Miss Finch's uncanny resemblance, the break-in with its curious lack of theft, the anonymous letter, Mrs. Bellamy's guardedness, and now Mr. Prentice's near-fatal accident. All these seemingly disparate threads were beginning to weave into a coherent, albeit unsettling tapestry. Miss Marple paid another visit to Mr. Prentice in the hospital, under the guise of bringing him a pot of her homemade plum jam. He was still weak, but his mind was clearer. "It was him, Miss Marple," he whispered, his voice still hoarse. "The man I saw at the window, the one from that night, he was there, by the apple tree. And he had a tool, a cutting tool." He looked up, saw me, and just smiled. A cold, dreadful smile. And then he pushed. "Did you recognize him, Mr. Prentice?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm and steady. He shook his head, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "No. Too far." And the light was bad, but he was tall, and he had a very dark coat, almost black. A tall man in a dark coat observed at night. This brought to mind the fleeting silhouette Miss Marple herself had seen in an upstairs window of Rosemead Hall weeks ago. So there was indeed another resident, a hidden figure, actively involved in these sinister occurrences. Returning to Little Firs, Miss Marple knew she had little time. July 17th was tomorrow. She needed to act, but subtly, without arousing suspicion lest she alert the perpetrator or put herself in danger. Her target? The sundial garden, the nexus of so many of the strange events. She decided upon a solitary early evening stroll. The light would be fading, allowing for discreet investigation, but still clear enough to observe. She chose a path that led her directly to the perimeter of Rosemead Hall, near the yew hedge that screened the sundial garden. As she drew close, the metallic scent, which had previously been faint, was now unmistakably stronger, mixed with the damp earth and the sweet perfume of the roses. It was the smell of old, oxidized metal, perhaps even something buried, now disturbed. She carefully edged along the hedge, pretending to admire the blossoms. Her eyes scanned the ground, looking for anything out of place. She found the spot where Mr. Prentice had reported seeing the small, neat footprints, where he had found the odd, small object. The earth here did look recently disturbed, smoothed over, but not entirely concealing the underlying disruption. Then she noticed a particular rosebush. It was a climbing rose, heavily laden with dark red blooms, one of the black baccara varieties that Colonel Abernathy had mentioned was unique to the hall, cultivated by the old Colonel Hemming. But what struck Miss Marple was not the rose itself, but the soil around its base. It was too firm, too flat, almost as if a heavy object had been placed there and then covered, or as if the bush itself had been recently moved and replanted. The other roses around it had the loose, rich earth typical of an old, well-tended garden. This one, however, had an unnaturally compacted base. Miss Marple remembered the Colonel's words, old Colonel Hemming, kept a special leather-bound album of family photographs in a small sitting room off the library, and Mrs. Bellamy's quick dismissal of the previous owner's effects, and Miss Finch, with her own hidden photograph resembling the woman in the locket. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The missing items, the thimble, the book, were not stolen, but were perhaps a form of search or symbolic reminders. The disturbances in the garden, the anonymous letter, the attack on Mr. Prentice, all designed to either find something, protect something, or scare away those who came too close. Miss Marple stepped back, her mind racing. She had no proof, yet only a terrible certainty, but she knew what was hidden beneath that rosebush. It wasn't treasure or jewels. It was a secret far more potent, more dangerous, because it dealt with identity, with lineage, with inheritance. She knew she couldn't simply start digging. She needed to approach this with the utmost care and subtlety. She returned to the vicarage, her heart thumping with a quiet resolution. The next morning, July the 17th, dawned bright and clear. Miss Marple, after her customary breakfast, sent a carefully worded note to P.C. Davies, requesting his presence at Rosemead Hall that afternoon on a matter of some urgency and a delicate nature concerning the recent incidents at the Hall and a possible clue related to the old Colonel Hemming's effects. She also requested, through Mabel, that Mrs. Bellamy and Miss Finch be present. Then, with a purposeful calm, Miss Marple approached the vicar, Reverend Grimshaw. "Arthur, my dear, would you be so kind as to lend me your small spade, the one you use for your herbaceous borders? I have a sudden inclination to adjust a rather unruly rose bush at Rosemead Hall this afternoon, if Mrs. Bellamy permits. There is, I believe, something beneath it that requires careful attention." The Reverend, a little puzzled but always obliging, handed her the spade. Miss Marple smiled, a faint knowing smile. The time for quiet observation was over. It was time to unearth the truth. Chapter 10. The Unveiling. The afternoon of July 17th arrived, thick with unspoken tension. P.C. Davies, though somewhat reluctant, had arrived at Rosemead Hall drawn by Miss Marple's unusual request. He stood stiffly in the elegant drawing-room observing Mrs. Bellamy and Miss Finch, who both seemed to be teetering on the edge of a precipice, their faces pale and drawn. Mrs. Bellamy, in particular, kept glancing towards the sundial garden, visible through the drawing-room windows, her hands clenching and unclenching. Miss Marple, impeccably dressed and radiating her usual quiet dignity, entered the room, carrying the Reverend Grimshaw's small spade and the old garden shears wrapped in a clean cloth. She placed them gently by the fireplace. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Mrs. Bellamy. "Thank you all for attending," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but surprisingly commanding. "P.C. Davies, I believe you are here concerning the recent incidents at Rosemead Hall, incidents which, I fear, have been tragically misinterpreted." P.C. Davies puffed out his chest. "We've deemed the recent fall an accident, Miss Marple, and the earlier disturbance a simple opportunistic theft." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone unruffled, "and yet Mr. Prentice, the gardener, vehemently insists he was pushed, and the objects taken from the hall, like the silver thimble and the rare Tennyson volume, were found not stolen, but merely misplaced, sometimes even in the rose garden itself." "Curious, wouldn't you say, for a common thief?" Mrs. Bellamy suddenly interrupted, her voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. "Miss Marple, I hardly think this is appropriate. You are insinuating—" "I am merely stating facts, Mrs. Bellamy," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady, "facts that, when viewed together, paint a rather different picture. We have the gardener's tools being deliberately moved, small patches of earth being disturbed in the rose garden, a faint metallic scent, a locket with a faded photograph of a young woman strikingly similar to Miss Finch, found near a specific rosebush, and the anonymous letter speaking of unearthing the past and secrets coming to light, culminating in a coded warning for today July 17th. Miss Finch gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mrs. Bellamy turned a deathly pale. "And then Mr. Prentice's accident," Miss Marple continued, picking up the garden shears. "He was, I believe, struck and pushed by a tall man in a dark coat, whom he had also seen lurking about the hall on the night of the break-in. This man, I suggest, cut the branch of the apple tree, or struck Mr. Prentice with it, using these very shears." She held them up for all to see. "Note the distinctive rose engraving on the handle, identical to the carved wooden bird Mr. Prentice found in the garden. These are not common tools. They belonged, I believe, to Colonel Hemming himself, as a gift from his travels." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The break-in was a search, not a theft. The anonymous letter was a carefully crafted piece of misdirection designed to establish a narrative of being threatened, when in fact the threats were quite different. And Mrs. Bellamy's defiance was merely a preparation for this very day. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Bellamy. "You see, Mrs. Bellamy, the true secret of the rose garden is not one of hidden treasure, but of hidden identity. That faded photograph in the locket, found by Miss Finch, is of her mother. A woman, I believe, who was not merely a servant, but the illegitimate daughter of Colonel Hemming himself, born out of a secret liaison during his time abroad." Mrs. Bellamy's composure finally shattered. "Impossible!" she cried, but her voice lacked conviction. "Not impossible, Mrs. Bellamy," Miss Marple countered gently. "For years Miss Finch, whose true name I suspect is not Finch at all, has known of her lineage. She knew that Colonel Hemming, though publicly unmarried, had a secret child. This child, Miss Finch's mother, was provided for, but never acknowledged. However, before his death, Colonel Hemming, racked with conscience, prepared a new will, one that acknowledged his daughter and left a significant portion of Rosemead Hall, and his fortune to her, and thus to her rightful heir." Miss Finch, tears streaming down her face, nodded silently. "It's true," she choked out. "My mother showed me letters, a copy of a will she was to inherit, but the will disappeared. My mother was too frail to fight. I came here to find the truth, to claim what was ours. Mrs. Bellamy, she knew I was coming. She bought the house to prevent the truth from coming out, to destroy any evidence." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. Mrs. Bellamy is, in fact, the Colonel's distant niece, who stood to inherit the bulk of his estate if no direct heir could be found. She purchased Rosemead Hall specifically to gain control of it, to search for and destroy the evidence of the later will. The strange man, the prowler seen by Mr. Prentice, was none other than Mrs. Bellamy's own son, a shadowy figure employed to help her in this desperate task. He was the one moving the gardener's tools, digging in the beds, looking for the buried will. The thimble and the book were merely items he had disturbed in his frantic search within the house, and he returned them clumsily to deflect suspicion. Mrs. Bellamy sagged onto a chair, defeated. "He was only trying to protect me," she whispered, "to protect our family's inheritance. We needed the money." "The anonymous letter you showed Mrs. Ogden was from Miss Finch," Miss Marple revealed, looking at the now openly weeping companion. "It was a desperate warning, a final attempt to pressure Mrs. Bellamy before July 17th, which marks the anniversary of the Colonel's secret daughter's birth, a date often mentioned in the letters I gather you possess, Miss Finch?" Miss Finch nodded again, pulling a bundle of yellowed letters from her apron pocket. "And the metallic scent?" P.C. Davies asked, bewildered. "The scent of a buried metal box, perhaps," Miss Marple said, picking up the small spade, one that has now been disturbed, perhaps even struck, by desperate hands. For you see, Colonel Hemming, a man who loved his garden also loved a good puzzle. He buried his true will, not in a bank vault, but in the most sentimental and protected part of his estate, the sundial garden beneath his favorite black baccarat rose, enclosed in a robust, waterproof metal casket designed for perpetuity. Miss Marple moved towards the window, her gaze directed at the particular rose bush. "I believe, P.C. Davies, that if you were to carefully excavate beneath that specific rose bush in the sundial garden, you would find Colonel Hemming's final testament, a document that proves Miss Finch's rightful claim to a part of this estate, and a will that Mrs. Bellamy and her son were so desperately trying to unearth and destroy before today's anniversary." P.C. Davies, though still slightly flustered, recognized the quiet authority in Miss Marple's voice. He looked at the broken Mrs. Bellamy, the weeping Miss Finch, and then at the small spade. "Very well, Miss Marple," he said, pulling out his notebook. "We shall see. And if what you say is true—" He paused, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "Then Rosemead Hall's secrets are indeed far more tangled than its rose bushes." And with that, the elegant facade of Rosemead Hall and the carefully constructed lies of Mrs. Bellamy finally crumbled, exposing the truth as fragrant and as thorny as the deepest secret in the rose garden. Thank you for watching, and do remember to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries.